Hello, welcome to Nahashon Kimemia Live. Today we're going to deal about, there are three students, right? They were expelled, I think, suspended in 2014 from a primary school, right? Run by the Methodist Church. And this case has been ongoing. It went to the High Court, it went to the Court of Appeal, and now it went to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court, the apex court in Kenya, it finally decided that schools should set their own rules and that they can ban hijabs if they so wish, and not only hijabs, right, but also white trousers. This mostly affects Muslim students, right, because they are, I'll touch on that a bit. And whenever you look at Muslim students, the ladies, you'd actually see them wearing white trousers, most of them. Yes, I can't remember the name of the schools. It was way back in the day when I was in high school. So anyway, let's go into this topic right away. Right, so what happened? The Supreme Court in Kenya, right, overturned a lower court ruling that the schools should permit the girls to wear hijabs and trousers in school. That was the Court of Appeal. The High Court, so the High Court at first sided with what the Supreme Court said, that the school should determine what the girls should wear, should not wear. And then it went to the Court of Appeal, where the school they determined that the girls should have their way, and the school should continue with kind of like the schools should allow the girls to wear hijabs. So after that, now they went to the Court of Appeal, where the Court of Appeal now decided that, the High Court was right. It's also important to remember that the government officials at the bottom, the education officials at the bottom, they disobeyed the court order. And that's why the Methodist University went to the Court of Appeal. Anyway, that's a long history, a bit irrelevant right now because the apex court has decided. So in their ruling, the judges say that every school, according to media reports I had, every school should have the right to determine its own rules. Njoki Ndungu, the usual culprit, and Jackton Ojwang, they read the ruling, right? Anyway, so it's a Supreme Court ruling. So what is a hijab? What's the big fuss? Why is everybody talking about this kind of what happened, right? So a hijab is a scarf, right? Mostly worn by Muslim women to cover their necks, mostly their bosom, right? And to cover their hair, as per their religion, right? And just to explain a bit more about what the hijab is, I'll take you to a case back in 2010. A similar case, but this time it was the Kenya High School versus some students who are also suspended because of wearing a hijab. And that case went to court, and this is what happened. The students who were against that suspension, they were asking for an order of prohibition against Kenya High School, Boma. But Boma ladies, they're very good ladies, by the way. All of them that I've met. So that's by the way. Anyway, so they were prohibiting, they were trying to prohibit Boma High School, right, from interfering with the applicants' right to wear a hijab, because they are told the students not to wear a hijab, and they say that a hijab is an expression, a manifestation of their religious right under Section 32 of the Constitution of Kenya. So anyway, the permanent Secretary of Education at that time, right, he sided with the applicants, the students of Kenya High School, those few students. And he wrote a letter actually on 14th July 2009, and he wrote to all provincial directors of education, district officers, and municipal education officers. Honestly, it was a big deal. And the permanent Secretary of Education, he made sure that these guys realized that this thing was a big deal by addressing this letter to everybody at the provincial level, at the district level, at the municipal level, right? And he copied this letter to all heads of schools, as in he was making sure that they knew that this thing was a big deal. It was not a joke. So what was in that letter, right? The permanent secretary had said that he had noted that some heads of schools had refused to permit Muslim girls to wear a hijab. So he had taken note of that, and it had troubled him. and he felt that it's a matter that the government should handle. That's why he addressed everybody at all levels of government. So he reminded that no child should be denied the right to education on the basis of religion. Again, as part of the constitution of Kenya, you cannot discriminate people based on religion. And then he emphasized that this is a right in the constitution, in that letter, to copy to provincial directors, district officers, and municipal officers, and to all heads of schools. This was actually before the case went live, before it went to the court. This was in 2009. Before the case went to court, before the judgment was in 2010. And another thing that he said, he directed all principals, including the one at Kenya High, that have expelled students on the basis of wearing the hijab, that they must readmit them immediately. It was an effective order, immediate order, right? But it seems the Kenya High principal did not listen, because the judgment was in 2010. So anyway, it was a big deal for the government, and the government felt that it was a religious matter. And as per the constitution, the students should not have their rights infringed upon, right, by the school, especially by a school that receives government support, right, an assisted school. So anyway, what they did is that he got an affidavit, or in this case, right, the applicants got an affidavit from a sheikh, and that sheikh supported the case that this thing is religious. Remember the Rastafarian student? When I did the video, I actually showed that the rastas that she had on her head were religious. For me, they are not a religious symbol, right? But for her, they were religious, as per the Rastafarian movement. And I was able to show that through historical records and all of those other things. So these guys were trying to do the same thing. They got an affidavit from a sheikh, a religious scholar, and he was actually an imam of Jamia Landis Mosques or something, right? And this is what the imam said in the affidavit they took to court so that the court can make their judgment, the Kenya High case, that Islam as a religion is very particular about matters of clothing and ornaments. Very particular about those things, right? And he stated, this imam, Sheikh Ahmed M. Athman, right? He stated that wearing a hijab was a religious edict, a teaching of the Quran, and that it was mandatory for all Muslim women. So these guys have taken Kenya High to court because they have suspended or expelled them for wearing a hijab. And these guys are trying to show that this is a religious matter and the constitution protects our religious freedom. So this principle is interfering with our religious practice, our expression of our religion. And that goes against the constitution, right? So this imam was like showing that case an authority to show that it's actually from the Quran. It's actually religious. So me, the skeptic that I questioned, is it in the Quran? So I actually went to online and searched for it, whether it is in the Quran. And this is what I found, right? Quran 24:31. And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and they must guard their private parts, that they should not display their beauty and ornaments except what must be ordinarily displayed, right? Because you can't hide your eyes. Okay, others hide their eyes. That they should draw their khimar or something over their breast and not display their beauty except to their husbands or to their male relatives. So you can actually see that the Quran is actually telling them to cover some parts of their body and they should not display their beauty or even their ornaments, not only their beauty but their ornaments, except what must be displayed, and that they should cover their breast. Again, remember that the hijab is to cover the busum, like the breast, and then to cover the hair, which is considered a mark of beauty for women mostly. And they should not display those things except to their husbands. So you can actually see that the Imam, Sheikh Ahmed Atman was actually right. This thing is from the Quran. But just one more verse to emphasize that it's from the Quran. And Quran 33:58-59. Enjoin your wives, your daughters, and the wives of true believers, that they should cast their outer garments over their persons when abroad. Abroad means outside, right? Arab has some, anyway, abroad means outside. We'll talk about Arabic in later. Anyway, we'll talk about that. Very interesting stuff. That is the most convenient, doing that, like casting their outer garments, that they may not be distinguished and not be harassed. So the biggest problem at this time was that women are being harassed. So this guy was advising sorry, the Prophet Muhammad through Angel Gabriel was advising wives, daughters, and wives of true believers that they should cast their outer garments, like have something covering your garments, so that you have something, your outer garment, and there's the inner garment, over their persons when they are walking outside, so that they should not be harassed, that somebody not look at them and then start hissing, all those kind of things, right? And also to distinguish them from other women. Like when you see somebody wearing a hijab, it immediately hits your head, that's a Muslim woman, right? So it was a way of trying to distinguish Muslim women from the other women, and in this case the pagan women mostly. So you can actually see that even though the hijab, it's important to note, the hijab is not mentioned specifically in these verses, that there are some teachings here that would actually show you that covering certain parts is required, right? And that it distinguishes, prevents harassment. And then there's an outer garment, something that's beyond the garments you usually wear. So some people are actually trying to argue that since the hijab is not in the Quran, in these verses specifically, then it's not mandatory. So you could actually see some Muslim women not wearing hijab, and they would not call themselves bad Muslims, right? Because they would have that argument that it's not specifically mentioned there. From this reading, I believe that it's mentioned, though not specifically. Again, as a Christian, remember that the word Trinity does not appear in the Bible. It does not appear in the Bible, but it is a reality. So something not appearing specifically within a specific book does not mean that it is not there, or that book is not speaking about it, right? So that's what I believe. But there's an argument within the Ummah, the Muslim community. So anyway, just to go a bit further, does the Bible have something similar to the hijab? Interestingly, the Bible had it before the Quran, because I think the Quran came in the around 7th century or 8th century, I believe. The Bible is there at the 1st century, like AD, in the year of our Lord. So anyway, what we have, you actually see Catholic nuns, they're wearing something that would later become, let's say, known as the hijab, right? When even today there's something amongst Catholics, it's called the Latin Mass. And when people go for the Latin Mass, the women would actually have a black veil over their heads as they go for the Latin Mass, even today, right? And a funny thing, when you go, when people, digression, when women go and meet the Pope, they have a black veil over their heads. That's kind of like protocol when you're meeting the Pope. But for royalty, like women who are royal, stately, or whatever, they actually have a white veil over their heads. So that's something similar. Again, the Wakorinos, they have something similar on their heads. Again, I'm not saying that the hijabs come from Christianity, although Christianity, the veil precedes the hijab, but also the other kind of like, it comes from ancient days, even before Old Testament, it comes from ancient days, and it's a practice across many communities. I'm just giving that. So anyway, 1 Corinthians 11:5-6, to show this kind of veiling in the Bible, it says, on the contrary, the woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered does not respect her head, she might as well cut her hair. So if you're a Christian woman and you pray without your head being uncovered, Paul is actually saying that you're disrespecting your head and that you might as well cut it off. And if for the women prophets, if a woman is prophesying according to this verse with her head uncovered, then she is disrespecting her head. She might as well cut it off. Verse 6 is more specific. If a woman does not use a veil, let her cut her hair. So if you're a Christian woman and if you don't use a veil, then Paul is telling you to cut off your hair. And he's actually continuing with that verse and it's saying, it's a shame for a woman to have her hair cut or shaved. If it is a shame for you to have your hair cut or shaved, then use a veil. So it's actually giving you two choices. Use a veil or cut your hair. Right? So this is 1 Corinthians. So why don't the majority of Christian women cover their heads? Let's say like nuns or like the women who go for the Latin Mass or the women who meet the Pope. Why don't they cover their heads with a veil? Because it's very specific. If a woman does not use a veil, let her cut her hair. Because Christians interpret this verse differently. There is something that we focus on. And we remember that we are free of the law. That mostly what matters is what is in our hearts. That's how we interpret these things. In the church at Corinth, Corinth was a very immoral society. And this immorality was affecting the church at Corinth. So when Paul went there, right? This is the first letter, I think the second letter. He went there a couple of times. And he was trying to bring order to that church, the church at Corinth, to try to distinguish it from the immorality that's happening at Corinth. And what he did is that he established rules to bring order and then to maintain that order within that church, right? And these rules were for that church at Corinth, right? And for the churches at that time, because it was a Hellenistic kind of society, a Roman, the immorality was everywhere, right? Because Rome was everywhere. And Alexander had spread Hellenistic ideals everywhere. So it was for the church at that time and for those customs, right? And true salvation would lie in our hearts, not in rules. Again, Jesus did not come to fulfill the law so that Paul can introduce new laws. This one was a specific response to something that was happening to the church at that time. And that's why we don't focus on it. And some Muslims are trying to adopt this way of thinking as they interpret the verses in the Quran that I've mentioned. They are really, really trying. Who knows what will happen? Is this ruling a wise one? This ruling by the Supreme Court? Because you can actually see that the hijab is clearly a religious practice. It's very clear to see. We can actually see that by asking them to not wear a hijab, you're asking them to not follow their religion. The same way when you ask that Rasta chick to cut off a Rasta, you are asking her to go against the Rastafarian religion, right? So clearly you're denying them the right to education because they cannot choose their education over their religion. Because at the end of the day, mostly religion comes first in most cases. And for me, religion would always come first. And for the Christians, and I think the Catholics specifically, we have this thing we call conscientious objection. That if the state does something, and I think this DNA thing that the Kenyan government is bringing, it might bring some conscientious objectors, that it is well within your moral standing to object to those kind of things, right? So in this case, you cannot ask them to forgo their hijab so that they can have an education. It's a very tough choice, but at the end of the day, I would choose religion and they would choose religion. So you're being unfair to them because religion is a matter of the heart. So anyway, there's this case, and then the case of the Olympic High School. This ruling, let's continue. Dreadlocks are religious practice among the Rastafarians. I showed that in my many videos. The deputy principal was wrong in asking the students not to follow her religious practice, and many people supported her. Even Amina Mohammed, who ordered for her readmission. Note that fact. Ordered for her readmission. Instructed for her readmission. Right? So, there's this other side of the Olympic High School argument that people did not focus on. Imagine if dreadlocks were not a religious practice, that the girl was an atheist. Then would it be okay to deny her her dreadlocks, right? Because it's not a religious practice. Schools should provide proof that locks would interfere with learning. If they cannot provide proof that it would interfere with learning, then they have no right to deny dreadlocks, whether it's a religious practice or not. Why? Because we pay taxes to run Olympic High School. It's a public institution. So there cannot be preference over one person's belief over another person's, let's say, belief or practice. One person's practice over another person's practice. Because both people pay taxes. So unless you show me how my practice would interfere with education, you have no right to deny me that practice. Because we both pay for it, right? We pay for that institution to run. And that is why that ruling was unwise, because it did not distinguish between schools in Kenya. Because we have different types of rules. The judgment was right to a certain extent. It was wrong to a certain extent. It was right that this school in particular, had the right to institute its own rules and to enforce them. But it was wrong to assign this right to all the other schools in Kenya, because we have different types of schools. This lack of distinction, it would lead to chaos and confusion. And it's the direct result of judicial activism, where people make rulings based on their feelings instead on the law and on sound judgment. Because this guy made this ruling based on their feelings. They could not see how they would turn away Methodist University, right? Methodist Church, and still distinguish between schools, right? They could not see themselves doing that, because it would open a debate that I'm trying to open up right now. And these guys are afraid of debates, because they thrive on feelings and activism. So anyway, there are 3 different types of schools in Kenya based on what I have discovered. St. Paul's Kiwanjani Secondary School, the school that brought all of these kind of things, it's a church-sponsored school. And that's very, very important. What do you expect in a church-sponsored school? You would expect church rules. Dagoretti High School, the school that I went to, it was a government school. Everybody could follow their own religion everywhere. There was not a specific body that was overseeing that institution in terms of a sponsor, a church sponsor. So everybody was free to do what they wanted, right? In terms of religion. Makini School is a private school and it's Prezo affiliated. That's why I chose it as an example, because many people would identify with Prezo, the musician, right? So we have church-sponsored school, we have government schools, the ones I think they call them maintained schools. That's I think the official term for them. And then there's Makini School, which is a fully private school. Now, as you get more private, as you move towards the private sector, then private rules apply more. As you move towards the government sector, where everybody pays equally in terms of taxes to run that institution, then treatment must be as well equally, because you are contributing equally. But as the contribution becomes skewed, because you're moving towards private, then also the rule making becomes skewed. And that's what these guys fail to distinguish, right? So just a bit of history on church-sponsored school. It started from way back. Vasco da Gama came in 1498. Francis Xavier, a Jesuit missionary, came in 1542. The Augustine monastery was established in the coast in 1564. This was way back in the day, right? Way back in the day. And they didn't actually establish kind of like long-lasting institutions of learning, but they established some things. But they didn't last. Because after the Portuguese were taken away, then we can like return to Arab and African ways. So then there came another encounter. Jonathan Ludwig Kraft came in 1832, and the first missionary school to set up in Kenya was set up at Rabai near Mombasa in 1844. And after that, the Catholics came back, the other Protestant movements came back, and it was just starting schools wherever you go, of course under the protection of the British government, Her Majesty's government. So anyway, what they did was that there's this guy, his name is Stephen Mwoki Joshua, and he does a good way of breaking down how like the role of the church in schools, right? So I'm using most of his research from this point on. He distinguishes between a specific period, 1844 to 1963. And this is what he says. During this time, what the church did, it was a donor and it was a manager. It built those schools and it managed those schools. It financed those schools, it recruited teachers, it trained teachers. It oversaw the implementation of curriculum. It taught catechism. It taught the skills, writing and reading, to understand that catechism. It approved new teaching approaches. In essence, the church at that time was the Ministry of Education, in one way or the other, because it was doing everything as per the schools. From 1844 till independence, that was the church. And by 1920, right, the missionaries, they were trying to meet the demands of the converts, because converts were becoming more and more. Kibaki, what is his name? Jomo Kenyatta, all these others, meeting the new converts into the church. And then it was really trying to do something, because by 1920, the church had realized that the government was trying to monopolize education. Remember that Her Majesty's government had other ideas of education, to build a workforce for the colonial settlers. That was their idea of education. The church had another idea of education as a tool of evangelization. And even before today, or before independence, the church knew that it was going to fight it out with the government. And so it was trying to build as many schools as possible, to be in as many institutions as possible, and to do as much as possible in the education sector, to prevent the government from monopolizing education. Her Majesty's government at that time, before independence. So what happened after independence, right? The church was reduced. It was a donor, it was a manager. It was reduced to a moral authority. By who? By the newly independent government. What Her Majesty's government could not achieve, the independent government achieved. That is pushing the church out of education. The government saw that the church had overshadowed other stakeholders in the education sector. Like, it was doing too much. It was like I said, it was in one or the other, the Ministry of Education, recruiting teachers, training teachers, hiring them, curriculum, they are there, approving teaching methods, they are there, building new schools, they are there. It was everything to the education sector. And the government did not want this. It wanted to expand its authority in the education sector. So it set up the Kenya Education Commission in 1964. And this commission, it led to the report. It's called Education Act of 1968. So that report led to that act. The commission was headed by Professor Simeon Ominde, and it did not have any church or missionary representation. Imagine. The church was doing these things so much from 1844 to 1963. And as soon as 1963 hits, these guys are not even represented in a commission. even representation. It can show you what the government was trying to do to the church in the education sector. So anyway, whereas churches were managers of the schools before, they became sponsors, like overseeing spiritual. Sponsors does not mean financial support. It just means overseeing the school, like in terms of development, in terms of like how it will move, in terms of how it will teach its students and all of those things, how it will approach its students, all those kinds of things. Oversee the development and success of schools, including the spiritual development of students. That's what sponsorship actually means. But in some cases, it also includes money. So anyway, what happened after Ominde and his commission alienated the church from education matters, like from the commission overseeing all those matters? What do you expect to happen? Education started deteriorating in Kenya. It was not as valuable as it was before, back in the day, right? And so what happened? Those guys who could afford education, they sent their kids where? To private schools. And they also sent their kids to the schools where the church had more say in that institution. And these schools where the church did not have says, they stayed for the poor and all those kind of people. Why? Because when you introduce the government in sectors where it's not supposed to be, it will lead to inefficiency and it will lead to failure. But if the private bodies trying to push, let's say like education, those bodies will perform well. Of course, they have their own agenda, like evangelization, but they will perform well. So that's what happens. And what happened was that the church realized that guys are starting to move towards the private sector, and the government is pushing us out of the public sector. So he started investing in private schools. And the rich followed them in the private schools. So only the poor were left with poor performing schools. Government expansion is dangerous. So anyway, between 2004 and 2017, the church became an investor in education. Like they had seen, like they're pushing out of this way. So let's become more private. And even guys are willing to pay because the rich now are following us in the private sector because we are the best at providing education. So what happened? The government now, what it did, it started squeezing them even further. Because previously, right? Okay, so now what they had to do to propose a chairman to the board of the church-sponsored school, the Ministry of Education had to ratify it. To prepare learning resources for religious education in church-sponsored school, the Ministry of Education had to ratify it. Previously, the school would hire a chaplain and pay for that chaplain with the school budget, right? But now, the church had to do that. And if the school would use their funds like they did previously to fund a chaplain, then they would have some legal actions possibly, right? So you're getting that the government is like trying to gain more control over these schools. And these schools were built by who? By the church. The act also reduced the number of board members that the sponsors could have, right? Previously they would have 4, now they have 3, only 3 members. As a result, the churches started resorting to private schools because they're being kicked out of the previously they had churches run schools. The government came in, right? It reduced them to sponsors. And then even as sponsors, the government is still kicking them out, right? And now it's pushing them towards the private sector. So I'm hoping that you can see what's happening to the church and in schools. Again, the principal aim of the church was to evangelize. The significance of the church-sponsored school or the church in education in Kenya. The Catholic Church alone, it runs 31% of all the schools in Kenya. The Catholic Church alone, 31% of all the schools in Kenya. It runs 27.72% of all the primary schools, 31.9% of all the secondary schools in Kenya. It runs over 2,500 early childhood education development institutions. It runs over 220 vocational institutions, over 21 teacher training colleges. That's the Catholic Church alone. So imagine taking the church away from education. Would we have an education sector? Because other churches are still performing well. African Inland Church sponsors 3,500 primary and secondary schools in Kenya. So what would happen if you keep kicking the church out of Kenya? It will move to the private sector. And the rich guys who are looking for quality in education, they would move there. So it actually harm the poor. And we can actually see how important the church is when it comes to education in Kenya. If you take them out, let's say today you take them out completely, the education sector would collapse. And that is why the government could not kick the church completely out of those schools after independence. It had to reduce them to sponsors because it knew how important they were. And even in 2004, that's why the government could not really kick the church out of education completely, because it knew how important the church was to education, even as sponsors. So that's why it's trying to kick them out slowly. And that's what I'm saying, that this ruling was a very, very bad ruling, because it did not distinguish. The government is expanding again. It's expanding in terms of taxes. It's expanding in terms of the personal information it wants from you. It's expanding in terms of the housing sector. It's expanding in terms of the universal health provision of universal health. It's now expanding in terms of education, pushing private sector players out of the field and establishing its authority. The monster is growing. The Leviathan is growing. And you can actually see it growing here. You cannot eat your cake and have it. Somebody cannot build a school and then you come and take that school from them. And then you want your rules in those schools, even though they're sponsoring those schools. They're sponsoring them to push Christian ideals. You cannot expect them to uphold ideals of another faith. That is for public institutions, and for public institutions only, where there is everybody pays taxes, right? And those taxes, they go to meet everybody pays taxes equally, so treatment should be equal. But whereas there's a private contribution and it's increasing, then that private sector player, they're not doing it for only, let's say, for charity. They're doing it to push an agenda. That's Christian ideals. He who pays the piper calls the tune. The churches invest heavily in these institutions to promote Christian objectives. You cannot expect them to uphold principles of other faiths. These are semi-private institutions. They exist in a symbiotic relationship. Government took them from those who built them. If you do not like their rules, give them back to those who built them. And let them run the rules, the schools, the way they want them to run. Public schools should not have any of these rules. That's my opinion. So that's what I had for today. I hope that I've explained it a bit. How the government is trying to is like messing with the church on this issue. Let me finish at this point, right? I'll see you guys tomorrow. I think I'll explain a bit more. But that's the gist of what I had to say. Bye-bye.